welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling, well, it's one of the biggest questions in science, isn't it? The search for a theory of everything.
Absolutely. For decades, people have thrown immense brainpower at this. We've got string theory, loop quantum gravity, really complex stuff.
Right, but they all seem to hit these roadblocks.
Yeah.
And that's where our source material for today comes in.
It does. We're looking at excerpts from motion theory versus every other theory of everything, why everyone else got stuck and we didn't. It's, let's say it offers a very different perspective.
A bold title. And it makes a pretty bold claim, doesn't it? That it's cracked the problem where others haven't.
It certainly does. It argues it succeeds because it started by asking a more fundamental question that others supposedly skipped over.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. Let's unpack that central claim. What does this source say reality is really made of, fundamentally?
And why does it think the other big theories are, stuck?
Exactly. We're diving into its view on the basic building blocks and why it thinks its simple idea is the key to unification.
Okay, so the source jumps right in, arguing that maybe the problem wasn't the complexity of the theories, but the starting point.
What do you mean?
Well, it says most theories started with things like particles, forces, energy, fields. But motion theory sees those as outcomes, results, not the origin point.
So what was the fundamental question they supposedly forgot?
Simply, what is everything actually made of at the deepest level?
And this is where motion theory, as the source presents it, makes its big move.
It is. It proposes that everything, literally everything, is made of motion.
Not particles vibrating, not energy fluctuating,
right,
but motion itself.
That's the core idea, motion as the fundamental substance, if you can call it that, not even space-time as we usually picture it.
Okay, that's radical.
It is, and the source uses this single focus to critique the other major theories. It argues that even with all their sophisticated math, they didn't quite hit the mark because they didn't start with motion.
All right, let's get into those critiques. It sounds like comparing them really highlights motion theory's angle. First up, string theory.
Right. The source identifies its main weakness as having, quote, no mechanism.
No mechanism for what?
For the vibrations. The source asks, okay, you have these tiny fundamental strings. What makes them vibrate? It claims string theory just assumes they vibrate, and different vibrations give you different particles.
But it doesn't explain the engine driving it.
Exactly. It describes what might be vibrating, but not why or how it starts or keeps going.
Okay, so how does motion theory tackle that, according to this source?
It basically flips the whole picture. It argues there are no fundamental strings or particles like we think of them.
So what is there?
Structured loops of motion. That's it. What looks like vibration in other theories is, in this view, just the result of these motion loops interacting and resolving energy constraints.
Huh. So the vibration isn't assumed, it's an output.
That's the idea. And the source suggests maybe strings are just artifacts of how our math filters this underlying motion, not actual things.
Interesting. And it gets rid of the extra dimensions, too.
Apparently so. The source claims you don't need 11 dimensions or branes. The structure emerges naturally from motion syncing up with other motion.
Wow, okay, so it's not vibrating objects, it's vibrating motion. That is a shift.
A fundamental one, according to the text. Now, let's look at loop quantum gravity, or LQG.
Right, the idea that space itself is quantized, broken into tiny chunks.
Yeah, like little indivisible loops or pixels for the universe. The source sees a weakness there, too.
What's the problem with that? Seems kind of intuitive in a digital age.
Well, the source asks some tough questions, like what are these loops actually made of? If motion is fundamental, why would it be forced to jump between discrete points instead of flowing continuously?
Yeah. How do they maintain their structure?
Good question. How do these abstract loops hold together and interact without some kind of underlying continuous medium? The source implies LQG builds a nice structure, but maybe without a solid foundation for why space would be that way.
Okay, so if space isn't discrete loops, what's the motion theory alternative?
It argues the universe isn't built from chunks at all. It's all about a continuous process. Motion resolving itself through interaction with other motions.
So space isn't bits, it's potential.
Kind of. The source calls it a medium of sync potential, the inherent possibility for motion patterns to align and interact.
And quantization, the discrete effects we see in quantum mechanics.
That's explained not by chunky space, but by loop harmonics. Think of it like stable frequencies or rhythms of motion that hit certain thresholds, making them observable.
Ah, like the analogy in the source.
Mm.
Music making chords from timing, not pixels.
Exactly that analogy. It's about rhythm and resonance emerging from continuous flow, not dividing things into static bits.
That helps visualize it. Okay, next on the list. Geometric unity. The critique here is human-centric language. What does that mean?
The argument is geometric unity uses incredibly advanced math, really beautiful geometry, to try and unify physics. But the source claims it still relies on our existing concepts.
Like what?
Like time, mass, energy, force. It assumes these are fundamentally real things that just need a better, unified mathematical description. It rearranges the furniture, so to speak, but assumes the furniture was already there.
And motion theory's response.
It claims to go deeper, to redefine the furniture itself. It wants to clear the conceptual fog.
How? By redefining those basics.
Yes. Time isn't fundamental, it's just motion measured against other motion, like using one clock cycle to measure another.
And mass.
Mass isn't inherent property, it's resistance to motion synchronization. A kind of dynamic drag or inertia as patterns try to align.
Forces.
Not separate fields, but gradients in the structured motion itself. Differences in synchronization density or patterns creating pushes and pulls.
So it's really trying to rewrite the dictionary of physics from scratch, using only motion.
That's the ambition presented in the source, yes. To erase the old assumptions.
Okay. What about emergence theories? Theories where complexity, maybe even space-time itself, emerges from something simpler. The source flags origin as the issue.
Yeah, the critique is pretty straightforward. What is doing the emerging?
Meaning.
These theories might say complexity emerges from, say, information or fundamental degrees of freedom. But the source asks, what is that information? What are those degrees of freedom made of, ultimately?
So it's saying they assume emergence happens, but don't specify the substance it's emerging from.
Pretty much. It suggests they might lack a truly fundamental starting point.
How does motion theory claim to avoid that pitfall?
Well, according to the source, it doesn't need some mysterious underlying code or substance. It posits raw, unresolved motion as the only starting point. Everything else, form, feedback, synchronization, order, is created by that motion interacting with itself.
So the order isn't assumed, it's generated.
That's the claim. Atoms, for instance, aren't things that mysteriously emerge. They're described as stable, self-reinforcing patterns of motion, refined motion locks that have found a persistent rhythm.
Okay, that clarifies the distinction. Let's talk about the standard model. Hugely successful, but everyone knows it's incomplete. The source calls it assumptions piled on assumptions.
Yeah, and descriptive, not generative. It's brilliant at telling us how particles behave, how forces work. The math is incredibly precise.
But it doesn't tell us why.
Exactly. Why these specific particles? Why 3 generations of them, seemingly arbitrary? Why do the sources have the strengths they do? What actually is the Higgs field beyond the thing that gives mass?
And the big one, why doesn't gravity fit in?
Right. The source views the standard model as an amazing rulebook, but not the explanation for the rules.
So how does motion theory propose to answer those fundamental whys?
The source suggests it provides the mechanism underneath, those 3 generations of particles, explained as nested levels of complexity and structured motion.
In the Higgs field.
Not some separate field, but more like a description of the synchronization thresholds or resistances within the motion loops themselves, what we perceive as mass.
And gravity.
Gravity, the source argues, isn't a force in the traditional sense, but simply convergence towards higher synchronization density. Areas where motion patterns are more aligned, more in sync, naturally draw other motion patterns towards them.
So it's trying to explain all these features not by adding new things, but by showing how they arise from this underlying motion.
That's the core claim. Remove the assumption of particles as fundamental and see the motion that generates those effects.
That's a lot packed in there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, finally the big one. Quantum mechanics. Famously counterintuitive. The shut up and calculate approach. The source points to the lack of explanation for what's actually happening.
Yeah, this is central. QM works unbelievably well for predictions, but the interpretations, they're mind-bending. Is it a wave and a particle? Does looking at something change it? Where's the quantum world stop and our normal world begin?
It leaves the reality underneath quite mysterious.
Very. It gives probabilities, correlations, but not a clear picture of the underlying process.
And motion theory's answer to all this quantum weirdness.
The source claims it explains it all through structured motion. Quantum uncertainty isn't fundamental fuzziness, it's desynchronization, difficulty in perfectly tracking or aligning interacting motion patterns.
Superposition. being in multiple states at once.
Explained as motion exploring or resolving multiple potential synchronization paths simultaneously.
And the collapse when we measure something.
That's described as a rhythm lock. The motion pattern synchronizing into one stable, observable state. Observation isn't creating reality, but our motion patterns, the act of measuring, syncing up with the motion patterns being measured.
So it aims to explain things like wave-particle duality, entanglement, all as behaviors of motion syncing and desyncing.
That's the assertion. To take the weirdness out by providing a physical mechanism-structured motion instead of relying on abstract math or observer effects.
It sounds like the big selling point, according to the source, is its simplicity then.
It is. After walking through all these critiques, the source summarizes its case. It argues motion theory wins because it's not adding complexity, no extra dimensions, no undiscovered fundamental particles, no patchwork of fields.
It's peeling layers away.
That's the idea. Peeling away assumptions to get to one single principle. Reality is structured motion, constantly syncing, adapting, and refining itself into stable patterns.
So the power lies in explaining why structure exists at all, not just describing the structure we see.
Precisely. The source calls it the ultimate unifier for that reason, not just unifying particles and forces, which other theories attempt.
But unifying the reason for existence.
In a sense, explaining why atoms form and hold together, why motion loops persist, why galaxies swirl. It claims to reveal the fundamental process that generates all structure and phenomena, all arising from self-organizing motion.
That is a very sweeping, incredibly bold claim indeed. So, stepping back, what does this perspective mean for, you listening? How does viewing the universe as structured motion change things?
Well, this view, as the source lays it out, suggests that everything you experience, everything you are, it's all part of this grand story of motion.
Everything. Like gravity holding you down.
Yes, and the light hitting your eyes, the chemistry in your brain, even the very act of you thinking about this, asking these questions. It's all framed as different forms of structured motion syncing, interacting, evolving.
It shifts the picture from a universe of static things to something more like a dynamic, ongoing process.
Exactly. More fluid, more interconnected at the deepest level.
It certainly reframes the familiar world.
It does. And the source leaves you with this, well, almost philosophical final thought to mull over.
Which is?
That the story of everything isn't just some abstract theory we're trying to find. It is the universe's fundamental ingredient motion constantly refining itself into rhythm, into patterns, into the reality we perceive.
So it's not about guessing answers, but
as the source puts it, about remembering the motion, remembering the fundamental process claimed to be at the heart of it all.
Remembering the motion. A really thought-provoking way to look at the universe. Thanks for exploring that source material with us in this deep dive.